Good morning, evening, afternoon, or night, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the fifth episode of the Fifth Discipline Book Club. Today we're missing Wolfgang. He's got a crazy week going on, but we've got Dave, Eric, and myself as the stalwarts of the show. Our focus today is chapter 7 and 8. And I must confess, when I was putting together my notes a couple of days ago, I looked at my highlights for chapter 7 and went, wow, there wasn't too much that I highlighted in chapter 7. And maybe we're at that point in the book where we're going to start to accelerate. And then I got to chapter 8 and I started reading. And it was like, yeah, nothing new in the first few pages of the chapter. I've read lots of books on mastery. And then, oh my goodness, I got scared by how busy my highlighter was going, particularly my "this is an amazing quote" highlighter. What about you guys? How do you feel about 7 and 8?
I hit a point like 3 pages in where I had to pause and look back to see which words I didn't highlight in chapter 8. So, yeah, kind of the same. Couple points in chapter 7. I think we covered a lot of the conceptual elements there in the two previous chapters and the conversations around reinforcing loops and so on. And then, like you, I was like getting into it. It's like, okay, yeah, this is going to be what it is. And then it really was what it is. So, I'm excited.
Yeah, we we spent a lot of time looking at the diagrams last time, and this time we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at the quotes in the words. So it's going to be an interesting chapter, I think. Number 8.
All right, let's crack into chapter 7: self-limiting or self-sustaining growth. So fundamentally, the chapter was here's a new archetype, um, and I noticed we kick things off with a highlight from Eric. Did you want to kick us into this one, Eric?
It's hard to cold drop in, I think, but just the nature of the archetype and the example he uses of delivery quality suffering because you're pushing sales and you're not paying attention to the fundamentals. And I immediately started mapping that to transformations where you try to start steamrolling out arts for numbers 2, 3, 4, 12, 50, and forget that people weren't along for the journey of the beginning ones. And you haven't built that trust in that relationship. And that is to me a very key example of the balancing loop that he talks about, and it gets down into the next example of how to fix that. But applicant there's one application in here and no other highlights.
That's uh, that's a really nice insight. I hadn't actually made that connection myself, but you instantly gave me a flashback to an organization, oh, it must be 6 or 7 years ago now, where their first two arts were smashing successes, but they were causing a lot of friction with the system. And the CIO went, can't deal with this friction. Let's just change everything at once. And I went into a conversation going, this is great. I've had a beautiful start. Let's think about 3, 4, maybe what 5 might be. And it was, here are the next 20. Let's go. I want to rip the band-aid off. And, their next 3 years of pain as they smashed agility in while the system pushed back because of the things they hadn't fixed yet was an interesting journey for
And I got a picture for that one. I'll paste it down to the left.
them. Book or one of your decks?
Out of my old Journey of the Lace talk from, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, but it's enough that I decided to call it a pattern because you see in step one, you see success, people get excited, they want to do more of the same, and you try to do it all. And I've seen this repeated. I've seen, um, actually, this was the closest I ever got to a "you were right" from a CIO I was coaching. Um, and so he's like, "Yeah, we're on that boom thing, aren't we?" And yeah, yeah, you are.
Yeah,
Did you name it the firework pattern? It goes
I don't
up.
know that
And then goes, oh shit!
I, I'm not against that. I think I just did. Thank you.
that's beautiful. All right, moving on. What do we got? So The diagram I pasted in was the core diagram that he built to over the course of the chapter, where I think if there was any one thing that stood out for me, it's the gentle progression in the complexity of the models. We looked in the last chapter at models with two loops. Now he's really started to intersect, and you see the kind of connections of delivery time as the connection in the first two loops, and then adding in number of orders as the connection in the top two loops, and you start to see these wheels spinning. And I know I got halfway through chapter 8, and I'm going to deliberately avoid jumping too far ahead, but I got halfway through chapter 8 and I went, this just really triggered a thought for me I've got to process. And it was the thought actually about the journey we're on with shaping agility, and some of the interesting aspects to what we're figuring out along the way. And I started to write about it. I went, this is stupid. I got triggered to do this thing because of the fifth discipline. Why don't I model it as a systems diagram? And that notion of picking an archetype and building these fundamental loops, and then looking at the way that where's the intersection point between two archetypes, but always going back to a base kind of single loop as your building block. Was an interesting thing in terms of the way it provokes you to think as you build your own models. I think, Eric, you've already kind of pointed out the growth and underinvestment aspect of it. So I'm going to zoom ahead to serious highlight quotes. One of the ones that jumped out to me really strongly was this: managers in the middle of the syndrome see so many urgent problems requiring attention and they're unequipped to see the larger patterns. And, I thought of so many executives and senior managers that I've coached where I don't know that it was so much that they were unequipped to see the larger patterns as so overwhelmed by the urgent problems that it's very difficult for them to find the time and mental space to step back and look at the larger patterns. And I was kind of surprised I was the only one dropping highlights in for that.
No, I saw that one too, and I saw these three quotes. In fact, I pasted the one at the bottom. I thought they were really relevant to the kinds of things I see. Yeah.
Do you want to talk us through the quote you posted in terms of that linkage, Dave?
Yeah, I think having someone. The other thing is, when you're in an organization for a long time, the problems do become invisible to you to some degree because you work around them. So someone else coming in and seeing the patterns very quickly and saying, look, have you thought about looking at this area? Looking at this area, that's very powerful. The quote at the bottom, which is, if you can try and look at those patterns and build them into a story that has data attached to it, so people can understand the story you're telling them with numbers to back up what you're saying, that's an incredibly powerful package of kind of pointing out the pattern by using a story and data. And that, I've always found that a really, really, really compelling way to get people to buy into what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it's one of the roles for us as coaches is the voice of objectivity that's not caught in the system. And maybe it links us back to last week's discussions about cucumbers getting pickled if they're in the barrel long enough. That comment about you're in the system long enough, you're just used to working around the problems. And that moment where you come in from outside and you look and it's fresh eyes, but then maybe there's that complexity. And I'll always say, if I'm mentoring a coach, right, your number one skill you've got to master is patience. Not to just leap in, but to sit back and sort of build a model to begin the conversation. I saw you chuckling there, Eric.
Oh, the stories of patience and lack thereof in my mind when you said that. Yeah, the term, and I'm trying to think, I wrote this in a couple different spots this week, but the term "in the soup" and "learn to see the soup" are the ones that come to mind frequently.
It's one of the pieces, and probably it's the patience challenge again, where it's been a long time since I embedded as a coach. It's, multiple clients and you've got a day here and a day there, or in the post-COVID world, an hour here and an hour there. It enables you to maintain that level of detachment and patience, as opposed to back in the days when I'd get fully embedded and there would come a moment where I would just be trying to force, because I'd build that head of frustration, and then there'd be another moment where I'd sit back and I go, oh, have I just come to accept all of these things we can't touch? Because I've been in it so long. And I see that talking to my mates who are still embedded coaching. And every time you talk to them, they're just the head of steam that they want to blow off in terms of the level of frustration they've built up from being in the system.
There's a reciprocal or related element around acceptance that falls into there as a coach, which is when the problem you want to solve is not the problem your clients want to solve. And you may think this is the most important problem, so therefore you really want to push at it. And a little bit of the system drawing the archetypes and systems modeling might actually show you where you're wrong or help your clients see where your problem actually is a more pivotal leverage point. But to have the discipline to slow down and put that into visuals to show how the different problems are related and why one is more urgent or more foundational or more approachable than others, I think it can do a big service to yourself and your own emotions and your clients' success.
Well, I think you said it last week, I think, Eric, where you said that a lot of what we do ties into the theory of constraints. If there are a number of problems, you find the one that's the greatest constraint, and if you're lucky enough to find the one that the client also thinks is the greatest constraint, it's a rare day.
I think
When
there's an
problem number
element.
one gets,
Oh, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, it's one that sticks with me. When problem number one gets solved, problem number two gets promoted.
I think there's another piece of that puzzle, which is if you think about these diagrams as being iterative things. I know I got to the end of my messing around with models the other night and went, oh, now I want to fix this with Eric. Because it had helped me do some thinking, but what I wanted to do was to go, hey, let's look at this together. Are you seeing the system the same way I am? And using fundamentally the model driving a conversation. And, Eric was very busy writing abstracts for the Berlin Safe Summit. And so I'm still waiting that moment where we actually look and play with the models together. But I think there's an interesting aspect to that when you put it back into a coaching lens. Because at the end of the day, as a coach, you can never change the system. Right? You can find the person that is bringing you in to coach. They're the ones who can change the system. And whether there's that lens that says you build a model and then you test the way you're seeing the world with the person you're coaching, and then you iterate the model through that testing, and that then becomes the vehicle perhaps by which their attention moves from what they can see to what you can see in that iteration of the model, and then it starts to equip them to drive that next level of conversations that's actually going to do something. So that's kind of my again, thinking process about starting to use these models more is the model not just as a visualization but as a conversation, and a way that they're going to iterate as you start to play with conversation.
And something you said early in there struck me a little bit, and it's just a reminder, especially for people that are in internal consultant roles like LACE coaches and people like that, is as a coach, you can change the system, but you're no longer a coach. And it is a choice. It's not a hard line like some people I think make it out to be, but just recognize that while you draw yourself into the system, the actions you choose to take in the system will define your role in the system.
Well, we all have different hats, right? And we put a different hat on at different parts of where we are according to the problems we face. And the coaching hat is, you don't always wear that hat. You sometimes have to move into a different mode with your clients. As far as, I mean, sometimes I'm working with some clients at the moment who wouldn't respond to a model, but they will respond to the visualization of a value stream with specific problems laid out to them and data. They will respond to that. It's a model. It's not the same model as one of these, but it's a very specific type of data you're using to make the problem visible to them. So, there are more than one type of model, and there's more than one type of hat you wear at any one time too. So.
And I think sometimes the coach asks you to wear a different hat. Sorry, not the coach, the client. Right? Mark, I don't need a coach right now. I need X. The peril is if you keep the wrong hat on too long, as opposed to going, I'm happy to put that hat on for a minute. Like I will often get used as in an interview chain. Right? Hey, got somebody I'm thinking of hiring, director of X. I like them. Can you have a chat to them and sort of sense check for me? Which most certainly is not a coaching gig. And they never feel like an interview. But however, that was everything we highlighted in chapter 7. So record speed, we're done with a chapter in 15 minutes. Any last thoughts on chapter 7 before we move on?
So we need to fill at least 15 to 30 minutes of space before we move on. Is that how time boxes work?
Absolutely.
I think we need to take a 15-minute deep breath because we got a great big chapter coming.
All right. Chapter 8. Now we're into part 3 of the book. And the chapter is called the part 3 is the core disciplines building the learning organization. Chapter 8 is personal mastery. And, we sort of warmed up by talking about how scary the chapter got. And I know I got halfway through the chapter because when we set out to do this book club, in our naivety, we said, first episode, we're going to do chapters 1 through 7. And so read up to the end of chapter 7, we'll talk about it, and then we'll do the next block next week. And of course, it's now taken us quite a few weeks to get to the end of chapter 7. And I had to read chapter 8 fresh, and I actually only read it 2 days ago. And I sat down and I started reading, I started highlighting, and I hit a point, and the point was pretty simple. My son, who I've mentioned a couple of times here, is reading along in the book club with us. So one of our dinners every week will be he's watched that week's episode, and we sit and chat over dinner about the stuff from that week's episode. And so he knows the system and he knows the highlighting system. And I was putting together the Miro notes from it. And I said, mate, it's going to be a doozy this week. And he went, what do you mean, Dad? And I zoomed out to just show him how much green, and green, of course, is this was a crazy, amazing quote. And I zoomed out for him to show how much green there was on the chapter. And he went, oh. So, personal mastery. Eric, you've got the first quote on the list. You managed to squeeze it in above all my stuff.
You left a little room for me there. It's nice white space. I'll take it. But it sets to me, it just set the tone for everything else. And that is, I don't care what your goals are as an organization. If you're not growing and supporting the individuals and helping them become exceptional within your organization will never be exceptional. Yeah. And there's some later quotes around mediocrity and so forth that kind of resonate and stack on this. But for me, this was just kind of the killer opening that couldn't be ignored. We must invest in our humans if we want to have an exceptional organization. There's no other path.
Great start.
And that's literally the first paragraph, isn't it? Which I also highlighted. I mean, it's literally that right under the title. It's like literally that. So yeah, it's absolutely bang on. If you don't allow people time to learn new things, then how is your organization ever going to improve?
Yeah. All right. Jumping along. So if you haven't been following along or you haven't paid attention to my quoting style, and just as background for anybody watching, the way the notes for a chapter work, I prime it by laying out the quotes that have stood out to me, and then during the week, everybody else responds and adds their quotes on the side, and try and glue them together. And my system is a white quote was it stood out to me, I wanted to highlight it. A light blue quote was it stood out to me, I really want to talk about it. Like it's the next level. And then a green quote is, wow, this is amazing. And I never want to forget it. And I want to find it easily amongst all the things I highlighted in the book. And Eric gave me a little bit of feedback the other day that said, "Ooh, thanks for the color highlighting system. I'm going to steal that." And one of the things I've been doing probably in the previous episodes is dropping white quotes in to give us a little bit of context and flow through the chapter. When I had so many green and blue highlights this week, I didn't put a lot of whites in, but I couldn't resist a couple of them. And first note that I had in white, Eric went, "This is green for me." So Eric, let's stay with you.
I think it's just the continuous flow on this one, and maybe part of this is that my partner Chelsea is very focused right now on her mindfulness journey and is investing a lot of time and energy in that space. And comparing and contrasting and mutually grounding the growth of confidence and skills and kind of the cognitive side at one time, and the wisdom and the stance and the calmness necessary to apply those competence and skills effectively and in flow on the other side, isn't just a passing comment. It kind of starts to become foundational to an individual application of these concepts. If I'm not working on both my emotional maturity and how I'm engaging into a space at the same time that I'm attempting to master the skills, concepts, and behaviors necessary, I'm not going to get very far on either front. So the unified whole becomes more important in the context of this journey to personal mastery through one's life.
Which I'm going to take as a segue to my first green quote. When personal mastery becomes a discipline, an activity we integrate into our lives, it embodies two underlying movements. The first is continually clarifying what is important to us, and the second is continually learning how to see current reality more clearly. And, I've mentioned before, I think in one of the early episodes on this, if not this, on another stream, right? My coaching mantra is the Jerry Weinberg, help people see their world more clearly and then let them decide what to do. And then this just triggered a reflection for me of, I spent a lot of time coaching others. What about coaching myself? What's the trigger to see your own current reality more clearly? And it comes back to the kind of othering concepts from the earlier chapters. And it just jumped out, right? What's important to us and what's reality? And it was just a great base for, many threads that came along. And I think somebody else, was that you, Eric? The personal mastery must be a discipline quote linked up to this?
Yeah, I just was pulling it over and it's the same one. So
Yeah.
no really anything to add. It's just continuing that. I don't know, I picture it as almost a DNA strand helix of emotional and kind of wisdom growth and cognitive growth. And it, it pulls so much. I'm just feeling this in my own life right now, so it's kind of very personal for me at the moment. It just pulls so much out of that tension that we're going to talk about here in a hour or 5 minutes, depending on how long it takes, and the um, nature of needing to just tie everything you're doing to what you want to achieve and what you want to see in the world. Um, it, it's got a lot of personally compelling stuff in this chapter.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. It was a very journey into myself chapter. All right. Moving on. The juxtaposition of vision, what we want, and a clear picture of current reality, where we are relative to what we want, generates what we call creative tension, a force to bring them together caused by the natural tendency of tension to seek resolution. The essence of personal mastery is learning how to generate and sustain creative tension in our lives. So this is really the introduction of the creative tension concept that then threads for quite a while. And I just thought it was beautifully expressed. And was it you added the bold, Eric, or did I add it and I can't remember adding it?
I added the bold, and then the follow-on comment he made, like I think in the next sentence, is it's lifelong generative learning.
And, the moment where this really, I think of that one about kind of seeing your current reality more clearly triggered the inwards reflection. It was the primer for this, because this whole journey of shaping ability, agility, building a collaborative community, learning, streaming, video editing, pick your poison in terms of the journey we've been on the last few months and the creative sparks that all of our conversations have triggered for me. It's just put such a pitch of creative tension in me in terms of, the way time disappears as I talked to Eric from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. last night about something I'd been working on during the day. Went to bed, set my alarm for 10 to 6, woke up, got out, started my coffee up. My wife walks out and goes, "Did you actually go to bed?" And I went, "Yeah, I slept. Got my 4 hours." And she went, "All this creativity stuff's not really great for you actually sleeping at the moment, Mark." But it's just this sense of energy that's happening for me. Dave,
I'm very much,
sorry.
I'm very much seeing the same thing. Like yesterday, actually, my coach on the couch was about the tension and that it's creating and pulling 12 hours of focused energy in a given day. Like that's unheard of for me. I'm very distractible. I'm very prone to disappearing off into games or walking the water side or whatever, and not staying focused on the things I ought to. And the joy of this is just pulling me right now. Hours upon hours of focus time that's unheard of.
Mr. Dave, you've got to
Yeah.
add to my next quote. So why don't I throw to you to kick us off?
Well, so people with a high level of personal mastery are acutely aware of their ignorance, their incompetence, and their growth areas, and are deeply self-confident. But I put that quote up there saying perhaps a good dose of imposter syndrome is a useful personal trait. So imposter syndrome, there's a little bit later on in this chapter which I think was great about like modeling the changes you want to see. So being the model for the things you want other people to be doing. And one of the things I think I find is when I find myself up against people who I feel are incredible role models for the things I would like to be, the things I would like to learn, it forces me to get the books and start reading and reading and reading because they know more than I know and I want to get better. So even though it says that, I don't know if I have personal mastery, I do know that I need to read a lot and I have a burning ambition to learn more because people like you guys, like other people, I want to know the things they know, so I have to read more. So I always know that I've known Mark for a long time, and every time I bump into Mark, I come away with 3 books I need to read. So I've got I've got a library of books in that room that are books that Mark said you should read this thing, and I've read them, and it's fantastic. But I do think genuinely that imposter syndrome, if you use it in the right way, can be a phenomenally good way of understanding more and learning more. You can use it to your own advantages, and I think it's fantastic. I think we've all got a little bit of that in us.
That's an interesting linkage. I didn't go to imposter syndrome at all in this. I listen to you and I go, it is a nice self-evident linkage. Um, I I just thought it was just such a beautiful phrase in terms of the contrast. Acutely aware of your ignorance, incompetence, and growth areas, and deeply self-confident. And that, I think you can link it back through a coaching or agility perspective to the idea of being comfortable with ambiguity.
Yeah, I
And
think it's okay to know that you don't know something, and when you need to know it, you can learn it, or you can talk to someone and learn it. It's okay to know that you don't know stuff, but it doesn't mean to say you can't learn about it and get up to speed quickly.
I've had a life of people in my life trying desperately to understand what it is that I do. My kids all grew up going, "How do we tell our friends what you do, Dad?" And my father has also had regular conversations with me trying to figure out what it is that I do. Because, of course, he desperately wants to be proud, but he just doesn't understand it. And I'll tell him little snippets of what I'm doing. He's like, "How on earth are you qualified to do that, Mark?" In terms of, coaching into a particular area. Uh, what's the moment when you're coaching the CFO of a bank? How are you competent to do that? And that world of, yeah, I know nothing about being a CFO of a bank, but I'm pretty confident I can find some useful questions to help them think, and then I can learn as they think to find better questions. So that willingness to kind of brazen your way in, but also at the same time acknowledge everything you don't know and be vulnerable about things you don't know. So it's a lovely setup for the coaching life. Eric, you had a huge comment with lots of bolding, also linked to this.
I did. 1 second. All right. I I don't think I had any one piece of this I wanted to pick out so much as I just really loved this list as a set of aspirational personal behaviors. And it was kind of in that same section you highlighted, or at least adjacent to it. But this idea it's like, okay, if you have a purpose, but you see today clearly as a friend and as an amplifier, not as something to fight, and you can flow with change rather than resist it, and you're inquisitive and always wanting to see more, and you're willing to do all that without sacrificing your uniqueness, like that defines people I want to spend a lot of time with. And it kind of defines who I want to be as I grow up. So there wasn't a lot of depth in that so much as this is just a really good list I don't want to lose.
It is a great list. I don't actually remember highlighting that block, but it's interesting how just looking at the words you've bolded go, oh, what a block of text. And then I ask
And it
myself
didn't
whether that I can tick off everything on that list when I think about me.
sometimes for each of us, not other times.
It's a useful trigger, isn't it? I'm not sure how regularly I'm good at seeing current reality as an ally rather than an enemy. But I do too badly at acknowledging it.
I think my previous kryptonite on this list was sacrificing uniqueness in order to fit in, which is kind of an anti-coaching behavior at times. Because there's don't excessively provoke the system. You don't want to get yourself fired before you can be useful. But there's respectful ways to stay unique without having just to become part of the system to fit in.
That's the interesting tension with patience, isn't it?
Hmm.
That question you want to ask or the provocation you want to issue, and you can't do it yet. And navigating that period of all of the things that you're wanting to challenge and knowing now is not the time without losing hold of them. Hmm. Do you see a kryptonite there, Dave? Join the club of acknowledged kryptonite.
No, it's all it's all pretty good stuff, isn't it? I mean, maybe a lot of this links back to that pattern recognition thing from the last chapter, even though there was a couple of small things. I mean, maybe seeing a pattern about working with some people for a long time and seeing the pattern about when to talk about things and when not to talk about things, that recognition becomes really important. And if you're outside the system, you get to learn very easily where you need to intervene and where not, because you're familiar with a culture like that culture. You've worked in a culture like that before. So it's great. But there's also, over the other side, there's an image that someone's added. It's
Oh,
a very interesting image here. Yeah.
let's take a look at
Wonder
that.
who added a picture randomly into a mural board. I have no idea.
Did that just appear off screen a minute ago, Eric? I don't remember seeing it last night.
Apparently, yeah. I don't know. No, this is triggered around the aware of your ignorance and the connection to our agile fixation with Dunning-Kruger effect came to mind. Yes, I chose my words carefully there.
I listened as you chose them carefully. I resisted writing Dunning-Kruger on this mirror at any point with fierce resistance.
The words still don't exist on there.
I love the grown-up mountain phrasing.
Yeah, so this one, just a credit, it looks like it's from Wait But Why. It was just in Google image search result, but I found this one more colorful and interesting than most.
That's a flashback to that conversation with Sahil a few weeks ago, where my comment was when I was younger and thought I knew more. And he went, "You're just accusing me of being young."
Yeah. I'm thinking though, honestly, like there's a handful of things I've been diving into lately, streaming, looking at AI in a new way and taking it to the next level, just a handful of other things in life. And that the glee that is apparent in the tumbling down the hill in this one. Like, I'm not choosing to see that as painful. I'm seeing that as Ford Somersault's joyful 5-year-old, indestructible until you get to the bottom mindset. And it's like, that's what it should feel like. And I'll get to the bottom and I'll feel insecure, like, how am I doing? But like digging in and feeling that abyss of knowledge that I vaguely was aware was out there, but hadn't wanted to confront until now is so fun. Or maybe I just like people who find that fun. I mean, that's a different view on it.
Yeah, well, you just gave me reflections to how much I am seeking advice from my children on this journey, or how much they're offering unsolicited advice. Do you want to share the story of the webcam you just held up?
Just it was related more to the cycles in the previous one. Interesting data point. There is far less Amazon porch banditry in Mexico than there is in the US because Mexico is far happier to admit it has a petty theft problem, and therefore you can't get things delivered without being there to receive them. Just another interesting balancing cycle to solve problems. But more interestingly, I can now have multiple views with the same quality instead of the hideously washed out one. So I'm excited. And it came a day early, which is phenomenal.
All right. Let's jump along. So I have a white quote, you have a green quote, Eric. Why don't we throw to you again, given you've got the green? We want it because we want it. Take us away.
It's really just that. When we do things for their own sake, they have more power. And then he goes on to talk about the pivotal moment when enough people take the stand. And I'm just getting all kinds of flashbacks from reading deliberate, or it's an everyone culture, a journey to a deliberately developmental organization or something like that. But an everyone culture finds it if you search for it. And the stories in there, Blackstone, I think, Mark, you just looked at Ray Dalio,
Yep.
and then a couple other case studies of places where radical transparency is enforced as a cultural requirement, like beyond norm. It is like truly a core value, but then it isn't used to punish, it is used to uplift and grow. And maintaining those two things together and the power, and like I just wanted to go work for any of those three companies in any role, like reading about that. So it just comes back to it's like, why do we want this? Because we want it for its own damn sake, because it's so powerful and enlightening to you as to me as a human.
Yeah, it was interesting listening to the Ray Dalio. I haven't read the book yet, but I went and listened to the podcast on the Tim Ferriss show. And he was describing their approach to radical transparency and some of the moments it creates. I was listening to going, that's amazing. Could I really imagine that happening in any enterprise client that I've ever worked with? What would it feel like? Because it's so uncomfortable. And, you know, we've obviously one of the values of shaping agility is radical transparency. And, you know, we've shared a lot of learning moments on the show where you go, hang on a second, I'm notionally an expert and I just sat in a conversation and was most obviously not an expert in some moment that was brought to my attention. And there's a vulnerability in that. And it's been actually a really interesting journey being that publicly vulnerable about the gaps and the growth opportunity. But we've done it in a notionally very safe way. With our number of viewers at the moment, it's pretty safe. There might come a moment when there are more viewers and it'll feel a little bit less safe. But I tried to picture that across, and there was a really interesting comment when they were probing it on the podcast about, how do you make it safe for that? And the importance of, the baked into the culture safety of the way that the transparency and the vulnerability is managed. And yeah, it's worth a listen. If I know Eric, he's probably pulling up a link to the podcast while we chat to stick in the chat, but I'll put it on
I'll take
YouTube
that while I'm
afterwards if not. Usually you put it up just as I think of the fact that it'd be good to put it up. All right, let's talk about the next pair of quotes. And wow, these ones spoke to me. So I'm going to talk about them as a pair because I think the first one is the warm up to the second one, right? The first one, scratch the surface of most cynics and you find a frustrated idealist. Someone who made the mistake of converting ideals into expectations. And I read that one. Yep, known plenty of those. They're the people who gave up. You strike them, they've worked at a company for a long time, and their first comment is it'll never change. This will be here until the next CIO, and then it'll be something different. Pick your poison. And the joy I've taken a number of times now of, as we get agility to work, taking those cynics and reminding them of the idealism that triggered them in the first place. I particularly find that with my government clients. So, first quote, my cynics, I went, yeah, I recognise my clients. Here's the second one. There are teachers, social workers and clergy, says O'Brien, who work incredibly hard until they're 80 years old and never suffer burnout because they have an accurate view of human nature, of our potential and limitations. They don't over-romanticize people, so they don't feel the great psychological stress when people let them down. I went, oh, that's been me again and again and again. Very passionate, very idealistic. And, my reflection was, I remember taking pretty much a year off work, burnt out for exactly this reason. And, one of the ways I think Eric and I have really connected this year is he did kind of the same thing for pretty similar reasons, right?
Yeah.
That moment of kind of recognition and reflection, and I see it in not just myself, like, boy, I recognize it myself because I can just think back through my life and go, these were moments and cycles where that happened. But I also see it in some of the favorite executives I've coached who are passionate, do have an amazing vision, and then hit these moments of reality and burnout. And yeah, all right, did it hit you, Dave? I know Eric's hit, but I'll pass to you before I pass to Eric.
I think certainly I hadn't thought about the green one where you've got people who are doing these things for 50, 60 years and it's very intense, but they don't burn out. I'd never really thought about that before. But what we do can be extremely frustrating. I think we all tend to become very passionate, and we all tend to get very, very frustrated. So it is a profession where you can burn out if you're not careful. I guess the difficulty is spotting it. The difficulty is having a community where you can kind of vent some of these frustrations out and get rid of all of that kind of frustration. And that maybe this community is one of those things where you can actually just discuss it with people and get rid of that frustration, and it helps. Because I'm sure you found that when you are a coach for senior people, sometimes they say, I'm sorry I'm venting on you, but you're also sometimes a pressure valve for them to vent all of their frustrations out too. And you see that very, very clearly a lot of the time too.
Yeah, that's the 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the evening call. And I don't know, we talked about it on some other stream. And in fact, I reconnected with a past client to make an introduction to another client because I thought they'd have a good chat recently. And the feedback, the reply was, Mark, I miss our calls as I'm driving home late in the evening. And so just unload because of the pressure that builds up. And, the nights when you go, yes, I was just a safe place for you to vent. And then the nights where you go, okay, now that you've vented, do you want to talk about it a little bit? And being able to sense the gap in the two. Eric, anything to add?
I think, yeah, probably. I was looking at time and energy on this one. One of the things I used to look for in hiring with coaches was two related factors. One is explicitly hiring for resiliency because of the challenges that come with something like this. And then with that was the courage that comes with this. And the way I would almost test for that is like, I want coaches who already have other job offers, who already can go somewhere else. Because somebody who's afraid for their job is going to burn out faster as they try to engage and hold the tensions that they have to. And it's like, I need somebody who feels safe if we're going to confront the size of challenges that a senior transformation team is trying to take on. The other thing that struck me as you were talking is around expectations. And I think it was first pointed out to me in Solve for Happy by one of the Google engineering leaders. But it comes up time and time again in some of the spiritualist and mindfulness context is the relationship between happiness and expectations. And the more tightly you hold to your expectations, the less happier you generally are as a person. And then how that plays forward into coaching and consulting and quote unquote driving change or enabling change or inspiring change, pick your favorite verb there. But all that just comes together around that nature of expectations and the feeling of being let down when your expectations aren't met. And there's not really an upside of having them. There's the vision and that creative tension we talk about, but this is really getting at the emotional tension we'll talk about soon.
All right. Thank you for making me look at my watch. But let's do one last piece in this opening section. Pair of quotes here again struck me putting my agile hat on, a little bit of zooming out of myself into the world. To empower people in an unaligned organization can be counterproductive. If people don't share a common vision and don't share common mental models about the business reality within which they operate, empowering people will only increase organizational stress and the burden of management to maintain coherence and direction. And one of the causes of burnout that I've seen in enterprise agility pretty regularly was a beginning agile message that says, now you're empowered, a sense of expectation amongst the people that they should be fully empowered, and the gap between the two, either with craziness created while people operate in their sense of empowerment, or the disillusionment that happens when they face into going, you told us we were going to be empowered and they're not. But then that real reality, and it was nice when the latest update to the SAFE decentralization principle came out recently. They really lasered in on the David Marquet, clarity and competence framing for decentralization of decision making, which of course is the empowerment. And that's long been the message to me around, how do you decentralize responsibility? You've got to take care of clarity and competence, because if you don't take care of both sides of that equation in balance, it's not going to work. So, yeah, I thought these were really good and relevant to our world.
Yeah, and with all the conversations we have around purpose and vision right now in various contexts, like this quote is going to get used in a variety of environments, I think.
All right, section 2, personal vision and creative tension. Eric, your first cab off the rank again. Lucky I'm leaving these little spaces for you, isn't it?
It's really convenient. um, this is one that actually came up for me a lot traveling this summer. And it became a piece of a number of different conversations, especially traveling with a teenager, but just in general, is how often people frame goals as negatives. And that one just leapt in my face, and I'm like, oh, this isn't new. This has been around at least 20 years and probably a lot longer. And it kind of comes back to that conversation around satisfaction and expectations and happiness. Um, the more you frame goals around expectations that aren't being met, the more you are likely to be dissatisfied and unhappy. And when you try to set a big vision that's around something you don't want, it fizzles out really fast and doesn't really go anywhere. So the story that came along with this, the language around it here, it hit me.
So, kind of taking on the back of that, pair of quotes here for me, right? The first one, a subtler form of diminished vision is focusing on the means, not the result. But then the one that really jumped out was the ability to focus on ultimate intrinsic desires, not only on secondary goals, is a cornerstone of personal mastery. And he built this thread of a backstory on his way to this quote. And it was the backstory, and he gave a couple, but the one that resonated with me was, a beginning goal, which was make a profit. And then digging into that goal to go so that I can remain independent. And then digging a little bit further so that we can operate true to our ethics, our values, and our vision. And that trace path he ran of the goal that kind of looked like an outcome goal of profitability, and then actually going to what the real drivers were for the company, which were, truth to their purpose and their vision, was a really interesting thread. And it triggered a question for me that I have not had a chance yet to deliberately play with, but I've found quite a few times, because I do a lot of work where people are trying to get OKRs figured out. And you have a session, they've got some OKRs, and then you come in and you provide the voice of questions. And it almost felt, as I watched his story play out, like he was running 5 whys on an objective. And as he got to the bottom of the 5 whys, he found the real objective. And then that triggered to me, well, what's the process I take people on when they start with their OKRs and then we start to get towards better OKRs? Is I don't know that I've ever explicitly run it as a 5 whys exercise to find the real objectives, but it'd be an interesting thing to play with as a deliberate approach.
That's a great insight, actually. That's fantastic. I love that. I mean, yeah, that's exactly what it is, isn't it? You're just unfolding the layers to get back to the absolute foundations of the whole thing. Yeah.
All right, next one, moving along. Everyone's had experiences when work flows fluidly, when one feels in tune with a task and works with a true economy of means. Someone whose vision calls him to a foreign country, for example, may find himself learning a new language far more rapidly than he ever could before. You can often recognize your personal vision because it creates such moments. It's the goal pulling you forward that makes all the work worthwhile. And back to comments about recent times. Wow, this just jumped. So you could take a buzz phrase and go, hey, safe 6, we've now got this time in zone metric. And this notion of getting into the zone from a flow perspective. But then I thought about the secondary impact. So, the story of learning to stream for me is I have spent my life going, there is not a artistically creative bone in my body. My wife paints. She's got lovely artistic capabilities. Various of my kids have amazing artistic capabilities. Um, but, that was not me. And, there came a moment somewhere in my coaching life where I recognized that not all art consists of drawings and that there probably was some artistic capability in me. But I've had a subscription to Creative Cloud for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. I keep it because it's convenient to have Acrobat and because I wanted my kids to have access to Photoshop and the other Creative Cloud tools if they wanted to use them. But I'd never even installed Photoshop or Premiere. Actually, I installed Premiere, played with it for about 30 seconds for some personal videos and went, this all just feels too hard. uh, Sound management. I've got a daughter who's a sound engineer, but I looked at sound management and the things involved in sound management and went, yeah, that's too hard. Because I had this kind of wiring that says if I can't be a master at something, then I'm probably not going to do it. Because if I step into it, I'm going to achieve mastery. I just won't settle until I've got good. And then I thought about this journey of the last 4 or 5 months for shaping agility and the number of things that I have gone, I want to do this, therefore I'm going to have to learn how to do that. And time has just disappeared. Back to Eric's comment about 12 hours of focus time, of stopping and learning so many things that I've never known and never made the attempt to learn or have looked at and given up because I recognized how much work was involved. And now it's like, yeah, that's just so much time. And I think that, the number of geeky conversations you and I have had, Eric, about cutting down post-production time on videos and playing with AIs to generate transcripts to make it easier to find chapters. And
The joy in figuring out new things has never been non-existent for me. I love chasing squirrels. There's a reason why Pollyanna the squirrel is sitting on the couch behind me. And yeah, I named her Pollyanna because I need somebody that's always going to be even more positive than me because it's hard to do sometimes. Um, but it's changed. It's no longer chasing shiny, which means I dip a toe in, look at it, learn a few things, grab the patterns well enough to hand wave as an architect. Now it's like I want to know what mastery feels like on this so that I can pursue it when it's time. And doesn't mean I go all the way, but the depth of learning and the depth of energy I'm willing to put into it on all these little things, like I don't know, last night it was diagnosing and then doing some research about why certain color temperatures would cause a chiming in my microphone. It's like little things that would normally just screw this. I don't need that. Are more like, this is kind of fun. I'm curious about this and it pulls me in, even if it's not directly on vision. And having the time and space in life to pursue that has been delightful, but having the vision makes it meaningful.
yeah. And then you get the side impact of the skills you master for this, then transfer to other things. That could be something really trivial, like iconography was my recent example. I'm building a deck for a training course next week, and usually the only way images make it into my decks is if I go to Shutterstock. And then I've been playing with Midjourney lately, but I'm really just not wired that way. And I looked at something and I went, oh, I want a new icon for this. If it's a slide, which is an exercise, which is personal reflection as opposed to group discussion, I want an icon to indicate that it's a personal reflection type activity. And so I go to Midjourney, a couple of slash imagine prompts later, I get something useful in all the wrong colors. And it's like, oh, hang on a second. I could just easily load that into Photoshop and just fix that so that it becomes the icon I want. And it then became that transferal of I've mastered this in pursuit of that, but then I'm starting to get the side benefit of all of the skills that I had to master along the way towards the goal that really drives me to uplift what I'm doing in other places. So,
Well, your goals
Nothing.
stop you getting sidetracked, don't they? Because I mean, I've been down that journey of because I was an ex-graphic designer, and the whole Photoshop thing, I left it for a few years and came back to it. And there's this whole series of eureka moments where you set yourself a little goal and you get it, and you master it, and another goal and you master it. But I tend to go off on these tangents, these wild tangents. I go down these black holes that I need to drag myself back out, and I don't necessarily have a goal to keep me going in one direction. So it does massively help to stop yourself getting sidetracked down these interesting but ultimately futile kind of black holes, which are interesting and they're fine if you want to learn stuff, but you don't. If without an aim, you're just always just meandering all over the place. I find myself doing that a lot in technology. OBS a lot. Did that a lot a few years ago when I was mucking around with OBS because it's a black hole of technology you can fall into. There's so much to learn. It's crazy.
oh yeah. All right, let's move along. I got a pair of quotes here. One from me, one from Eric, and they look very closely related. So I'll kick us in and then I'll pass to Eric. A vision with no underlying sense of purpose, no calling, is just a good idea. It's all sound and fury signifying nothing. What a beautiful turn of phrase that was. Conversely, purpose without vision has no sense of appropriate scale. And, where did it jump to me? How many discussions have we been in where we talk about vision statements versus mission statements versus purpose statements? And his whole way of framing this relationship of vision and purpose was just a beautiful framing, and all sound and fury signifying nothing. So that was me. Eric, throwing to you.
I do have a sweet spot in my heart for that passage out of Macbeth, just because I had to memorize it in secondary school. I dropped it into the right just for the heck of it. But it is I don't know, just the noise of organizations, and it really does apply, like just the sheer cacophony of competing signals and emails about the critical future of the company and the number one strategy that are given equal weight in your inbox with the compliance training and the cafeteria lunch schedule and the fact that one area of one floor is going to be closed for renovations and you need to move your desk. And that was a day's sampling from one of my clients, by the way. Like, all that hit their inbox in the same like fourth emails. And small wonder that tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creep in this petty pace from day to day. You look at the amount of time that slips away on critical things, and like I'm moving. I get to move at a speed solo that I then it's I'm on 15,000 topics later by the time I get the second meeting on something. So it's really interesting looking at that and the whip perspective and the lack of alignment that comes along with the volume of noise and the volume of different things in the enterprise. And that's where it comes back for me to the nothing happens until there's vision. It's the vision that pulls you out of that swirl. And frankly, it's the vision that makes the swirl, exposes the swirl for the walking shadow that it is. That's just strutting and fretting around. I feel like this passage could actually be an entire conference talk now that we're talking through this. So um, that's what it was in it for me. And then this diagram, this tension between current reality and vision that you're moving around. I guess you're not sharing the screen right now, but that diagram is one.
I'm flipping back. I was just dragging stuff out of the way so we could focus in.
Yeah, but the that picture then is the one picture that stuck with me from my first read more than anything else. All the diagrams, everything else, that metaphor is the one that carried forward for years.
I, again and again, reading this book, I've realized just how much I wasn't ready to see the first time I read it 20 odd years ago. But that diagram, you gave us a sneak peek last week because I got to this in the book and I went, oh, I've seen that before. That's right. Eric dumped it in last week. Great quote, right? Until we establish the scales we have in mind, we might think we're communicating when we're not. Sitting right next to this rubber band between vision and current reality as the illustration of creative tension. And there's a world in which we could talk about just that diagram, and then a world in which we've got a whole bunch of quotes below that really dig into the tension and the forces of the rubber band. But this is the playback to the intro quote around the creative tension between our vision and our current reality, uh, and the energy that creates in our life. And I think that notion of the rubber band's beautiful in terms of the energy.
And the metaphor that follows on around it could either the different paths it can take to resolve. That we'll come back to, I think, in the next sections.
We most certainly will. So back to systems diagrams.
I wanna make sure we don't lose the emphasis on the sense of scales though in the previous one, because there's a depth there that was important to me that we didn't get to,
Please
and
take us there.
it's the leader who says, I really think we should fix this problem. Let's pick I don't know, delay satisfying customer needs. And they say, I really think we need to resolve this. And in that executive's mind, resolving might be 6 months to 6 days. But in communications and conversations, people hear, oh yeah, we should shave a month off. That's audacious. We can get from 6 months to 4 months. And I see this in agility. Like, we talk about agile transformation as a term. And I've seen too many people seem to be satisfied with agile transformation meaning 10 or 20% improvement. And in I'm running around with 10x in my head. Um, Rally used to be, original name was factor of 4, because Ryan and Tim believed that they could get 4x the productivity from agility in the right environments and the power of teams. And the sense of scale, and especially when we're talking about change and transformation and vision and purpose and portfolio level stuff, is so critical if we want to avoid the we have to burn the bridges attitude and get to we want to align people with a positive vision.
I think it's one of the things that I love about OKRs as a vision tool. That pairing of the objective, what is it we want to achieve, or what do we want to change, and the key result being how we know if we've got there. And again, it kind of flips back if I think about facilitating OKRs, particularly the first few times people do them, is you think you've got an objective and then you start to go, how would we know? And you instantly discover how misaligned people are on their interpretation of the objective. Because you hear the 40% versus the 10%, the 6 months versus the 1 month. And they give you that discipline about conveying scale to go with intent. Not to geek out on OKRs. It's funny, I didn't think about OKRs at all while I was reading it and copying my highlights. And then as we've processed it together, it's like, oh, that's OKRs, that's OKRs.
Well, but the thing is, you can bite off chunks of change and see how far you get. So it's like Alan Kelly says that OKRs are like test-driven development for your organizational objectives, and that's exactly right. You're biting off some little bits here where you get, measure, and refocus, and try another bit. So yeah, I think they're fantastic things.
And that's where it gets interesting for me around them, because there's the audacious goal, the big hairy audacious goal version of an OKR that I value so deeply because it gives me a sense of scale of what people want to achieve. And then there's and we need to be successful this 2 weeks, this quarter, we'll feel like failures. So we're gonna put the watered down one in there, not the 10x one that gives us a moonshot and at least we escape the atmosphere.
One of my favorite clients who, like, every time that I'm talking to someone else about OKRs, I wish I could show them hers, because she just writes amazing OKRs and uses them really well. She actually adopted a pattern, and there's probably a book that mentions it, or maybe she made it up. Her pattern was when she puts together OKRs, she's got a flag and she calls it a moonshot. And she'll have OKRs which are the kind of, you know, we've got to chase that and it's meaningful and probably achievable without too much stretch. And then she's got the other flag, which is this is the moonshot. And it's a way of pulling out the key results that are the audacious goals, whilst managing the expectations of a company that's usually not used to expressing goals that are moonshots, uh, in terms of some of the expectations that go with them. And it's been a really nice tool of just kind of nuancing, being able to call out the audacious while acknowledging the less audacious. I don't know if you guys have seen anything similar to that with your OKR work.
You've got to call out the ones where the good looks like 70% and brilliant looks like 100%. You've got to call those out. Otherwise, they are tricky things to get balanced properly, aren't they? They really are. So
I see that. I feel like I've seen them more actually around PI objectives than I have around OKRs,
Interesting.
where people are, and it's in those cultural dynamics and the gaps between cultures where like, tell me what you're aspiring to give me, and ones that are, you will be punished if you don't give me exactly what you say, or at least people perceive they will be.
Yeah.
And those dynamics expose the need for more like almost your committed, uncommitted become that in some of those less ideal situations. Like we need a way to say what we're really trying to do, but we also need a place to make commitments.
Yeah.
And I'm a little hesitant about the same mechanism being used for both.
Yeah. I
I feel like
yeah.
we could draw a circular archetype diagram of some sort here.
I feel like you probably could, um, particularly if we get down the PI objective rabbit hole. However, just before we move on, I'm going to do a time check, right? So if I zoom out, there were 5 sections to the chapter, and there was probably equal meat in all 5. We're in section 2. We're coming up 10 minutes to the hour and a half, which is usually our block for this. So it's feeling to me like, face reality and go, obviously not finishing the chapter this week, but close out the personal vision and creative tension as the kind of this week's discussion. Is that making sense to both of you? Cool. So let's talk about the loop now that we've paused on scale. Taking the diagram of the rubber band, beautiful, simple, powerful, turning into a systems diagram, also beautiful, simple, powerful. I love the way that he explored this gap between creative tension and emotional tension, and the often confusion between the two and the overlaps. And, it was this notion of if you're passionate about something, there are going to be emotions that come with it. And some of the emotions that come with it are actually your creative tension, but some of them are just going to be driven by, in many ways, the current reality, or the things you haven't seen about the current reality that are causing the vision to seem like it's getting no closer. And if you get the two confused, what's going to happen is they're going to drive the wrong things in your actions. And, this fundamental message that he had was, if we fail to distinguish emotional tension from creative tension, we predispose ourselves to lowering our vision. Goes back to that burnout concept of, what's the vision? What's the reality? And if you fail to acknowledge the current reality and you just get caught up in angst about movement towards the vision and the fact that it doesn't seem to get any closer, how easily you drift into that lower the vision, lower the vision, lower the vision. And Eric, you had a beautiful highlight there. Why don't we throw to you on that one?
Yeah, so gaps can make a vision seem unrealistic or fanciful. They can discourage us or make us feel hopeless. But the gap between vision and current reality is also a source of energy. If there was no gap, there would be no need for any action to move towards the vision. Indeed, the gap is the source of creative energy. We call it creative tension. And I almost should probably roll that up next to the rubber band because that's where it fits. But
Yeah.
it I don't know, it's just so true. And when I take this framing on it and step away from the emotional tension, which he paints as fairly negative, and keep it tied to creative tension, which I feel is incredibly positive. It's a really good, I don't know, it's almost a really good guide to leaders of how to hold things for people and help build containers that people can find their own vision in.
So I think the link that I started to draw with this whole emotional tension versus creative tension and the rubber band of the, you know, potential to lower the vision. It took me back a little bit to the conversations we've had the last few weeks about our, you know, amp up the positive energy versus address the cause of the delay discussions. Because if you think about the thing that drives us to perhaps, use the fireworks model of agility as an easy example, right? That's the, urgent desire to pursue the vision. And, what generally happens after fireworks model, not long after for most companies, is abandonment. Right.
Yep.
And that pressure that we put on to go, just keep pressing towards the vision versus going, well, what's the reality and what's the thing that I've got to resolve or relieve in order to make the progress, to me really draws out that, your ability to see your current reality is highlighting to you that focus on what actually has to shift to release the tension and allow us to be pulled upward. Because you can think about those things in the current reality, as the diagram shows, right? Really is just exerting the downward pressure. And if you can resolve some of those things in the current reality, then that releases the anchoring that they have and allows your rubber band to contract upwards. So did you want to chat at all about your big emotional tension quote, Eric?
No, I don't think so. You started to hit it earlier when we talked about the giving up elements. Every time we let go of some of our vision, it just accelerates a loop of losing that vision. So that's enough.
Then in that case, I'm going to stay on this side of the board. Only mediocre people are always at their best. I highlighted it. I decided it was only a white highlight for me. I didn't stick it on the board, but obviously
Ditto.
somebody added it.
But it was a white highlight. It was just
Yeah,
there because it's an interesting turn of phrase.
it is an interesting turn of phrase, and it jumped to me because Max is in his final exams for high school, and we were talking about his next exam was coming up yesterday. And the day before, I said, "How are you feeling about it?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm feeling good. My goal for this is only 80%, and I'm going to do that pretty easily." And I went, "What on earth do you mean your goal's 80%? How can you have a goal of achieving 80%, mate?" We had an interesting discussion after that. Um, but on the way through, Dave, Roger Federer, give us the linkage.
Well, look, I think it's true that some mediocre people are always at their best, but there are people who set themselves very high goals and they can get there. And there are you said it. You've got to be brutally honest about your faults to get improvement. I mean, Federer knows he's retired now, so he's probably not the best of people to have picked to say that they're the best. But you got to know where you're weak in order to get better at your weaknesses. Because if you just get better at the things you're good at, you're never going to get better at the weaknesses, and you'll never get better all around. So that loop, that current reality bit is so important for you to adjust your strategy to achieve your vision. If you haven't got that, you're not going to get anywhere. And maybe that's what leads people to be mediocre, is because they're not adjusting for reality and they're not changing their approach to try and achieve the vision. That's critical for you to actually achieve any kind of success.
Which maybe takes us back to slow down to speed up. Do you think about all the sportsmen who've kind of broken their game to remake their game because they've seen some flaw in their fundamentals and then they've just broken themselves for months while they rebuild a fundamental because they know that that's what's stopping them from going to the next hilltop? That's an interesting analogy. Thank you.
It's just that it's a very good awareness of, like, Nick. I remember a story about Nick Faldo, who's completely rebuilt his game and then went on to win a couple of majors that because he wanted to win on courses that his game wasn't built to succeed on, so he completely rebuilt his entire game. I mean, that takes so much awareness of your current reality gap that it's just untrue. But that's the difference between people who are good and people who just never improve.
And there's a story coming up. I think it's into the next chapter, so I can't completely foreshadow it, about Bill Russell from the Celtics and the basketball Celtics, sorry, and the years of scoring himself after every game and never giving himself more than a 65 out of 100, despite being one of the legendary bests.
It's later in this chapter. I saw it and moved on because I just went, well, surely Michael Jordan was the best. I'd never heard of Bill Russell, so but it was a nice story, right? All right, lucky last highlight for the section. Mastery of creative tension transforms the way one views failure. Failure is simply a shortfall, evidence of the gap between vision and current reality. Failure is an opportunity for learning about inaccurate pictures of current reality, about strategies that didn't work as expected, about the clarity of the vision. You know, in the agile world, right, we've talked about learning from failure and safe to fail and, you know, fast learning cycles for years and years and years. So there was an element of this which is like, yeah, go figure. We've been talking about that forever. There's another element where I went, it's an interesting perspective to highlight what did I not understand when you're thinking about learning from the failure. What did I not understand? And, you know, there was a parallel, I guess, to me listening to the Ray Cilio podcast, because his opening and, you know, in the world of funniness and not being American, I'd never heard of Ray Cilio.
Ray Dalio?
Ray Dalio, sorry. I'd never, like, and that's, you know, I'm even getting his name wrong. I'd never heard of him until you pointed me at him. It's like, oh, okay, so he's a $160 billion man. But he opens the podcast talking about being a man who makes an awful lot of mistakes and fails a lot, and the way that he has leveraged failure to drive his personal growth, and the way that they leverage failure as opportunities for growth in their company culture. So I think it was an interesting prod to me to go, when you fail, you know, we're usually saying, what did we learn? And that step backwards to what did we not understand before we began is a really nice prod in terms of the learning loop, which is one of the reasons I really enjoy the improvement kata. I love coaching into the improvement kata because being very explicit about your PDCA cycle around what are you going to do, what do you expect to happen, what did happen, and then what did you learn, so often flushes so many false assumptions about the current reality when you build that. It's a great self-reflection technique in terms of people, usually for the first very long time that they're applying it, choosing their steps out of ignorance and then driving the learning loop from the steps to say, what did I learn about the people? What did I learn about the situation? What did I discover that I thought was true that wasn't true? Pulling you back into that, understanding your current reality. So, yeah. Any response triggers for you guys, or will we move into a close?
I think I'm ready to close.
I feel ready to close.
Yeah, it's been a heavy a heavy chapter, and we're only halfway through. A good chapter, though.
Look, I think if for me, reflection, there was a piece of me looking at the fact that we've been trying to up our pace and get through 2 chapters a week that looked at this chapter and went, that's really scary. And there was another piece that went, wow, when you read a chapter that provokes that much thought, that's amazing. And I set out this morning going, let's try and manage to get through at least, a rapid pass through chapter 7, and then we're going to have a crack at chapter 8, and got kind of halfway there. But my personal reflection is I've really valued the depth of the conversation, because it was a chapter that hit me deeply, and then some of the things you guys have brought up have set me down another level of depth charge on the stuff that had already triggered for me. So that's my reflection for the morning. You folks, closing out, retrospective.
It's probably should not be a surprise. But the more I dig into it, and it hit me a little bit while putting my notes on, but a heck of a lot more while trying to frame conversations, is how personal mastery is. Like I can't talk about it without getting deep into my own motivations and some vulnerabilities in there, and so be it. But I was more surprised by it than perhaps I should have been.
Yeah, it touches on a lot of areas that are very important for us if we want to coach successfully. And I think, it is a lot of food for thought. And there's more quotes from Shakespeare on this page than I've seen in a long time too, which is fantastic to see.
All right, that feels like a wrap to the morning. Thank you, gents. That's been a lovely brain space start to the day. And next week, goal, finish chapter 8. And hope that chapter 9 is not as provocative as chapter 8 was in terms of our restoration to the pace we'd been hitting. So just heading to the outro.